Okay. There we go.
Okay. Great. Okay. Thank you all. Thank you all for spending this Thursday night with me here. And I'm happy to update you on some of the more current things that are going on in the COVID landscape. Firstly, I want to just, as I've done in the past, I want to start with a couple of disclaimers. So I'm not a public health official. I'm not going to be speaking for any, public health agency or entity. I'm speaking on behalf of myself, and all the opinions I'm expressing are my own. But as you heard, I am a scientist. I have deep knowledge of the pharmaceutical and medical products industries, and I know a lot about how these products have been are regulated and how they get approved and get on the market, and the FDA regulation process. So you'll be hearing my opinions based on all of that knowledge and my current understanding and reading of the literature. I also want to point out, since this is a changing landscape, as we all know, everything that I'm saying here today is the state of affairs as I see it today, November 18th, 2021, and obviously could change in the future. As mentioned, I'm going to cover 3 topics. I want to talk about COVID vaccine booster shots for adults, COVID vaccines for children, and the general topic of where we are in the pandemic and how we should think about leading our lives. First, a little background on vaccines in general, because it's highly relevant to the topics we'll be discussing. So how do vaccines work? Smallpox, polio, measles, MMR, hepatitis, flu, you name it. The job of a vaccine is to teach the immune system to recognize certain pathogens so that when that pathogen comes along in the future, the immune system already is trained to fight it off. And actually the same thing happens if you happen to experience one of those diseases. Assuming you survive, your immune system has learned to recognize this particular pathogen and will fight it off the next time it comes along. Typically, in all of these other vaccines that we've all had and our kids have up until COVID, in order to accomplish this goal of teaching the immune system, a vaccine would typically contain either the virus itself in a killed form or the virus in a live but genetically altered form so that it's not pathogenic. And some of the more modern vaccines contain only a certain portion of the virus, usually a protein or a part of a protein that has been known to be the hallmark of that virus. And in those kinds of vaccines, the protein is typically manufactured synthetically by the vaccine company and not something that's actually extracted from the virus itself. In all of these vaccines, that material that is supposed to teach the immune system is injected, and the immune system will recognize it as foreign and will initiate an immune response. And that response is a process that involves certain white blood cells known as B cells, which will produce some highly specific targeted antibodies programmed to recognize and attach to that substance. And then there are other white cells known as T cells, which produce a variety of inflammatory and cell-killing substances and also assist the antibodies in destroying the pathogen. Once these white cells have all gone through this process one time for this particular pathogen, there remains a group of memory cells that are now pre-programmed to recognize this agent in the future and will be activated again if the same pathogen presents itself. And as I said, this is all basic vaccine technology. It's been around for over 100 years, but fortunately it's constantly improving. Now, if we fast forward to COVID, the story is exactly the same. The new twist is the nature of the vaccine. The vaccine material itself is now RNA, and that's the case of the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines, or DNA, which is the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, also the AstraZeneca vaccine, which isn't on the market in the US, but is widely used in many other countries. So instead of the injection containing a killed coronavirus or a live altered coronavirus or a synthetically produced protein from coronavirus, these vaccines contain instructions for the body to produce one of the components of the coronavirus, namely the spike protein, which is the mushroom-shaped protein that you always see all over the outer surface of the virus whenever the virus is depicted. So with our COVID vaccines, the RNA is injected into the arm muscle, into a muscle in your arm. It basically doesn't get very far. It bumps into whatever arm muscle cells are in its immediate area and enters those cells. And whatever material does not successfully enter a nearby cell gets destroyed immediately by various enzymes and other substances and white cells that are all around. So it's a bit of a race. How much of this material can get inside a cell before the body destroys it? But once inside the cell, the RNA directs the cell protein production apparatus to produce corona spike protein and then export that protein out of the cell. The RNA itself survives inside the muscle cells for maybe a day or two, and then it also ultimately gets degraded and eliminated as well. The spike proteins that were produced exit the muscle cells and start wandering. There are white cells that immediately recognize it as foreign and mount the immune response that I described, before for all vaccines, and ultimately destroy these spike proteins. So as far as the J&J and the AstraZeneca, which are DNA vaccines, the process is very similar, but involves an extra step, since the DNA then has to produce RNA, which then directs the production of the spike protein and ending up in the same pathway as the Pfizer and Moderna RNA vaccines. So once a person is vaccinated, either with a modern RNA DNA vaccine for COVID or one of the older ones for a whole panoply of childhood or other diseases, the vaccine does not provide you with like a Kevlar bodysuit preventing the virus from entering your body. For example, if there's someone with measles who's in the room, the measles virus will go everywhere. The virus has no idea who's vaccinated and who is not, or who had measles already and who didn't. It will attack everyone, but only the susceptible ones will actually get the disease, to get that disease that we call measles. And obviously some may become severely ill or die from it. The vaccinated ones, and also the ones who already had measles, will not get sick. And it's not that the measles virus knows who is who. The virus goes everywhere because that's what viruses do. And it does its best to reproduce itself because, again, that's what viruses do. And when the virus encounters an unvaccinated host, it succeeds. And when it encounters a vaccinated or a previously infected host, it gets inside, but it cannot successfully reproduce enough because the immune system shuts it down. And I have to say that no one really has studied in great detail what exactly happens during that unsuccessful infection on a vaccinated person. Presumably, the virus starts a small infection and then gets destroyed, and the host is none the wiser. Now with PCR as a tool, maybe we'll learn more about this process. PCR is very new and has not been used to study infections in real time up until now. And with COVID, things are now more complicated because we now have PCR and we have tools, and we are actually actively looking for the presence of minute quantities of virus basically in order to catch an infection early and prevent its spread. But at the same time, we're also detecting early infections that were never able to be detected before, even early infections that will never go anywhere because the vaccinated person's immune system will shut it down. Okay, so that's the biology lesson. I think with that information, we're ready to talk about the other stuff. So boosters. The punchline on boosters is that, or I should say the bottom line on boosters is that because the Delta variant is so infectious and so successful at what it does, that the vaccinated people are now susceptible to a COVID infection 6 months after their vaccination. I should also say, likewise, someone who had COVID is also susceptible to a reinfection 6 months out. For many vaccinated people, that infection could be very inconsequential. But for anyone who's in a vulnerable group, meaning that they're age 65 or over, or they have any of the usual litany of COVID-sensitive medical issues, the infection after vaccination could be just as bad as an infection without vaccination. So for everyone in that vulnerable group, a booster is an absolute necessity. For everyone else, a booster is very highly recommended. And here's the background. When the COVID vaccines were first developed, it was entirely unknown if they'll work or how well they'll work or what might be the optimal scheduling. As it turns out, the effectiveness came out way better than was expected. And the vaccines were launched and approved about a year ago in December of 2020. And as you all remember, there was a whole craziness of short supply, strict protocols, who's eligible, who's not eligible. And in this country, vaccines really didn't get started to be widely available until maybe February or March. On the other hand, Israel was much more aggressive. And the booster story is really all about Israel. If you remember back in 2020, when other countries, before the launch of vaccines, when other countries were unsure about buying vaccines and they were busy negotiating prices with various manufacturers, Israel made a very bold move. Instead of handling with vaccine manufacturers, Israel offered them a deal. I'll pay you full price and you put us in the front of the line. Give us all the vaccine we want. And in addition, we'll provide you with incredible data. And Bibi Netanyahu was relentless in pursuing Pfizer, and until the CEO of Pfizer agreed to his deal. And Israel's data-intensive nationalized healthcare service became a laboratory for studying and understanding COVID vaccines. And this is because the entire Israeli population is covered by national healthcare, and they're covered by one of 4 Kupot Cholim. And every single interaction that any person has with the healthcare system there is logged electronically and stored in the database of the Kupah. So any question that any healthcare researcher might want to ask can be queried in the database. You know, like, does XYZ symptom correlate with ABC condition or with this, that, or the other drug? It's all there. You know, basically you search and you'll find it there. So Israel offered Pfizer access to its database and its medical establishment. Every dose of vaccine would be documented and every outcome, near-term or long-term, would be monitored. And in fact, that is what happened, and that the world is now relying on this data. And when the Israeli doctors and scientists later published papers on COVID vaccines, their data sets were in the millions of people, not just a few thousand or even tens of thousands. It was really incredibly important work and amazing stuff. So Israel started to receive their vaccine in December 2020, right after the US approval, and began very aggressively vaccinating its entire eligible population of 16-year-olds and up. Something like 80% of the population above 60 years of age was vaccinated by March, April 2021, including more than 90% of the 80-plus-year-olds. And other countries like the US were way behind. By May of 2021, there was really no more COVID in Israel. But then it came back with a vengeance in July and August. They started to notice COVID cases in vaccinated healthcare workers in May and June. And remember, the healthcare workers were the first ones to get vaccinated. And then they started to see it in the rest of their population in July and August. So after studying this phenomenon extensively, the Israeli scientists determined that 2 things were happening simultaneously. 1, antibody levels were waning 6 months out from the second dose. And 2, the Delta variant came on the scene just at that time and was dramatically more infectious than all the previous variants. So even though the Israelis were vaccinated, the Delta variant was stronger than their waning antibodies and caused a new wave of infection. More alarmingly, in older population, meaning not so old, 65 years old and above, these Delta infections were not just inconsequential, but they were actually sending loads of people into the hospital. By late August 2021, the Israeli hospitals and ICUs were full again, both with unvaccinated people of all ages, including young unvaccinated people, and vaccinated people who had 2 doses and were over 65 years old. They were not seeing anyone in the hospital under 50 who was a 2-dose vaccinated person. So Israel started aggressively promoting a 3rd shot as a booster, starting with the older people, but very quickly accelerated it to everyone because they didn't want to get caught behind. That campaign started in August, and it was pretty much wrapped up now in October, and it basically broke the back of the Delta wave by mid-September. because the third shot gives the immune system a tremendous boost. If you think about the first 2 shots as teaching the immune system, the third one coming 6 months later is basically simulating an infection and getting the immune system and all its memory cells to gear up big time to fight it off. So now if a real infection comes along after that, the immune system has been strengthened and primed to respond quickly and with great force. Okay, so what have we learned? When vaccines originally came out in early 2021, everyone was asking, how long will they last? And the answer was, well, we'll know how long they last when they stop lasting. So now we know that over a period of 6 months, the circulating antibodies decline and are not able to quickly overcome a Delta onslaught. That doesn't mean that the immune system is unable to overcome a Delta infection. It just means that it can't do it quickly enough and allows the infection to take hold a bit more. And in older people whose immune system is less strong, and it's not talking about immunocompromised people, but just it's a natural fact that as people get older, their immune system gets weaker. The Delta variant created a full-blown disease, even in 2-dose vaccinated people. And for people who are younger, who had 2 doses, the Delta variant made them mildly sick or just testing positive with no symptoms at all. So the question is, how long will the booster last? Will people be getting boosters every 6 months? Answer, well, we don't know. It's another one of those we'll know when we get there. There is scientific reason to believe that the booster may last longer than 6 months. Maybe it'll offer protection for a year or a multi-year period. There is precedent with other vaccines where there's a strategy of initial vaccination with 1 or 2 doses followed by a booster, and they do get multi-year protection. But right now we don't know, and so it's speculation. But if needed, if boosters are needed every 6 months or every year, then it is what it is. So, it's certainly better than COVID, and it's certainly better than the ICU. Another question, who should get boosters? The Israeli health authorities were very aggressive in deciding and recommending boosters to the most vulnerable and then to everyone. Their thinking was they'd rather be ahead of the curve than behind it. Unfortunately, the US health authorities took the opposite view. They didn't want to detract from the message of pushing initial vaccines on the population. But now here in the US, we're seeing a Delta wave hitting vaccinated people. And now the local governments and the health authorities realize that they have to scramble, and they're basically scrambling to get boosters to everyone. I think we're expecting approval maybe tomorrow of boosters for everybody with no preconditions, or everybody 18 years of age or older. But basically, we were just 3 or 4 months behind Israel and are now having the same experience that they did. So my personal recommendation is that everyone should get a booster. For sure, anyone over 65 and anyone who comes in contact with unvaccinated people. But there's no reason for younger people or lower risk people to forego that extra protection. It's available, and why not? Right now, the kids in the 12 to 17 age group that were not part of the first approval are not able to get boosters because it's not yet authorized for that age. It's not the end of the world for them right now, since their approval didn't happen until June, so they're still at least a month away from the 6-month time point. And hopefully by then the barriers for their booster shots will also go away. Which booster to get? Answer, whatever you like. Mix and match as a strategy has been shown to be either a good thing or the same as doing more of the same. So if you like Pfizer, get Pfizer. If you like Moderna, get Moderna. Pfizer's booster is a full dose. Moderna's is a half dose. It was a decision by each manufacturer. It doesn't necessarily mean that half a dose of Pfizer wouldn't work or that a full dose of Moderna is too much. I don't think they really even tested all that. But if you're worried about side effects and prefer the half dose Moderna, go for Moderna. If you'd rather have the full dose Pfizer, that's good too. But just get a booster. Finally, an important word about J&J. This is really important. It's now becoming very clear that the one and done strategy does not work. The one-shot J&J is not nearly as effective, is not nearly effective enough to prevent infection, particularly in this Delta environment. So everyone who got a J&J vaccine needs to get a second shot. The second shot can be any of the 3 available boosters, but it is highly recommended to get Moderna or Pfizer and not another J&J, because the effectiveness of J&J plus either Pfizer or J&J plus Moderna is much better than 2 J&Js. And going forward, the J&J shots are no longer going to be one and done, and a second shot will be required after 2 months. Okay, let's move on to kids' vaccines. The FDA just recently approved the Pfizer vaccine for kids ages 5 to 11. Should we vaccinate the kids? Yes, very emphatically, yes. Why? Well, first, it's a myth that kids don't get COVID. With the Delta variant, they absolutely do. And while their symptoms can be mild, there is a small, but not zero, and very real probability of a bad outcome, either a hospitalization or a short or long-term effect, including myocarditis or the MIS-C, multisystem inflammatory syndrome in children. It's just, it's a low probability event, but it's a risk. Also, the unvaccinated children, even with a mild or an asymptomatic COVID, can very effectively spread COVID to vaccinated family members and other adults who may end up with a worse outcome. The disruption that the kids and the families have all experienced from quarantining is really terrible. And a vaccinated person, whether it's a child or an adult, does not have to quarantine because it does not have to quarantine if they were exposed to someone with COVID, because they are considered to be a much lower risk of either getting COVID or spreading COVID from that contact exposure. And the other factor is that the virus will continue to spread and mutate in unvaccinated people, because that's what it does, including children. And children are the largest group of unvaccinated people left, and their infections will lead to newer and more contagious variants. And really, we want to stop that. And finally, from socially, the environment for children will be so much better once the risk is reduced of their getting infected and infecting others. They can socialize, interact with others and with older family members much more normally. So for all these reasons, the 5 to 11-year-old children should all be running to get vaccinated. What are the risks? Since the pediatric vaccine is the same material as the adult vaccine, we expect to see a lot of the same things in younger kids as we have seen in the older kids and in the adults, with one big exception. The dosage is only 1/3 of the adult dose, so it's likely that the negative effects will occur much less frequently. And as I said before, the mRNA itself is harmless. It doesn't even last in the body for more than 2 days. The vaccine definitely does cause a local reaction, like all other vaccines, and the typical near-term reactions of most vaccines, which is fever, body aches, etc., which are all attributable to the vaccine stimulating an immune reaction. It doesn't happen to everybody, but when it does, it goes away after a day or so. Otherwise, the clinical trials on the 5 to 11-year-old kids and the experience on the market in the older kids and adults has shown that most other quote unquote side effects occur at the same rate in vaccinated as unvaccinated individuals. The one big exception is myocarditis. Myocarditis is an inflammation of the heart muscle. Pre-COVID, it occurs at a rate of a little under 1 in 100,000 children, and closer to 2 in 100, or double that rate, in 15 to 18-year-olds, predominantly males. In females and in males older than 19, the rates are much lower. In females, they're very low. Its causes pre-COVID were not always known, but appeared to be related to a viral infection. But it also occurred as a result of a bunch of other conditions. It's treatable, and usually there are no long-term consequences. So there is an elevated rate of myocarditis in COVID-vaccinated boys ages 16 to 19. There have been different numbers reported, but it's anywhere from 2 to 5-fold above the baseline incidence. This elevated rate is not being seen in females, and the numbers get lower in the males and everybody else as in the older age groups. It is expected that myocarditis will be lower in the 5 to 11-year-olds, both because of the lower dose and because the incidence in this age group is lower in general. I should add that the incidence of myocarditis and other medical complications is dramatically higher than these numbers in young adults who actually get COVID. In evaluating the risks and benefit of the pediatric vaccine, the FDA did a great analysis showing the numbers of children who, without a vaccine, would get infected with COVID, would get hospitalized for COVID, would end up in the ICU with COVID, and would die from COVID, and compared those numbers to the number of kids who would get myocarditis from a vaccine. They modeled several different scenarios for COVID infection rates. In all scenarios, except for the one scenario where COVID rates decline to where they were in June 2021, for any individual child, the probability of a hospitalization or an ICU stay due to COVID by not being vaccinated way exceeded the probability of a hospitalization or ICU stay for myocarditis from getting vaccinated. So unless you believe that COVID is going away, any child is better off with a vaccine than taking their chances with COVID. Question, should an almost 12-year-old get the lower pediatric dose or wait to turn 12 and get the adult dose? No, get the pediatric dose. The lower dose is due to immunologic factors, not height and weight. Younger people have a much more robust immune system, which is the opposite of the older people and their weaker immune system, and they get great protection with a lower dose. In fact, the 5 to 11-year-olds with 1/3 dose had antibody production on par with the 16 to 25-year-olds who were getting the higher dose. Presumably a 12 or a 13-year-old might do fine with pediatric dose, but it's never been looked at. Another question, what about long-term effects? Obviously, the long-term hasn't been studied. This is too new. But it's well known with other vaccines that any effect of a vaccine occurs during the first 1 to 2 months after the vaccine. And in this vaccine was studied extensively in the clinical trial for more than 2 months post-vaccine, and they didn't see anything that they didn't see in the placebo group also. And since the material in the vaccine does not last for more than a day or two, any potential long-term effect that one would want to invoke would be the result of the body's reaction to antibody production and the immune response. And presumably that's the basis for the myocarditis problem. So anyone who had COVID and created antibodies is in the same boat in terms of potential quote unquote long-term risk as someone who had a vaccine, except that those who actually had COVID have a whole panoply of other long-term effects from the disease, including effects on their lung function, long COVID, potential MIS-C, et cetera. I also want to emphasize that the scare stories about fertility and vaccines are just that. They are completely unfounded scare stories. They're basically blood libels. They're costing lives by scaring young people away from getting vaccinated. Bottom line, the clinical trials for all the vaccines, Pfizer's, Moderna's, Johnson & Johnson, AstraZeneca, all of them ended up having women who became pregnant in the study. And the rates of pregnancy and the pregnancy outcomes were the same in the placebo group and the vaccinated group. And now that the vaccine has been on the market and given to millions of women, it is clear that there's no effect on ability to conceive and outcomes from pregnancy. Those metrics are the same in vaccinated women as in the overall population pre-COVID. On the other hand, the negative effects on pregnancy loss and risk to the mother from getting COVID during pregnancy have been widely documented and are truly awful. And finally, this vaccine has been administered to huge numbers of people. As of last month, more than 6 billion doses have been administered worldwide, around 400 million in the US. The Pfizer vaccine is probably a little more than half of that. And the numbers are obviously, that was last month, the numbers are higher now. We know this vaccine, we understand it, it's safe, and it saves lives. So children should get it. Finally, on my third topic, where are we now? Having said all that, how should we be thinking about COVID now? Well, basically, my message is that this is it. I mean, COVID is not going away. Once the children get vaccinated, first the 5 to 11-year-olds who can get vaccinated now, and then the 2 to 4-year-olds whose approval should be maybe 2-3 months away. And then the 6 months to 2-year-olds, sometime after that, things will basically be as good as it gets. And the virus will still be around, and we have to figure out how to deal with it. Because for as long as there are unvaccinated people, and apparently that's not going away, COVID will continue to circulate and infect susceptible people, and new variants will continue to arise. Everyone who does not get vaccinated will get COVID. Unfortunately, vaccinated people may also get asymptomatic or mild cases as a result of unvaccinated people spreading the disease. Boosters will help keep the infections away or on the very mild side. And fortunately, drugs are now becoming available to treat COVID and avoid some of the worst outcomes. But we are unlikely to get salvation and see COVID disappear, and we just have to deal with it. As you know, I'm all about personal risk assessment. But first of all, you always have to make sure that you're not a danger to others. But once you're vaccinated and boosted, you're really not likely to be a danger to anyone else. Then you have to think about how you want to run your own life. You can do things as long as you recognize the risks and you're willing to deal with them. For example, spending time with family and friends is important. And I think we all have to learn how to continue to do that in a COVID environment. I am now a big fan of at-home rapid COVID tests. They're becoming more available, and I really would advise everyone to stock up whenever you can get them. You want the kind that look like pregnancy tests, where there's like a liquid that runs along a white paper and creates 1 line or 2 lines. And in the case of COVID tests, 1 line is negative and 2 are positive. When you're shopping for these, because now there's a bunch of them on the market, try to avoid the tests that involve complicated procedures or require a mobile app. Simple is better. I like the Abbott Buy Next Now and the Quidel QuickView for those reasons, very simple. Also, there's a brand called Care Start, but there are a bunch of new brands that literally just got FDA approved in the last few days or weeks, and have just, I don't know if they're starting to hit the drugstores. So read the instructions and avoid the ones that seem too complicated. But if it looks pretty straightforward, you swab your nose a few times, you put the swab in some liquid, put the liquid on this little device, and then wait to see whether you get 1 line or 2 lines. Those are the ones to get. By the way, if you're a medical professional, you may be able to buy them in larger quantities and for lower prices through your medical supplier, so you can look into that. But the beauty of the rapid test is that it's a very good indicator of whether a person is infectious right now. The limitation of these rapid antigen tests is that they're unable to pick up low amounts of virus. And that's true. They just, they can't detect below a certain level. But if someone is not making enough virus in their nose right now for the rapid test to detect it, then that person is not making enough virus right now to infect another person. Now, of course, that may change tomorrow, but if the amount of virus in that person, and so that may change tomorrow if the virus amount increases. But you want to know whether it's okay to socialize right now or to visit the older relative right now, and a rapid test is a very good tool to have in those occasions. Otherwise, I think the worst outcome for vaccinated and boosted people who test positive is the annoyance of quarantine. So although vaccinated people don't have to quarantine if they were in contact with someone else who has COVID, if they themselves have COVID, test positive for COVID, we're stuck with a 10-day isolation, which is really very, very disruptive. Now, there haven't been enough studies done to document the time course and the level of infectivity of a vaccinated person who, quote unquote, gets COVID. I mean, some preliminary studies are saying that the period of infectivity for a vaccinated person is very short because eventually the immune system kicks in and fights it off, and that the virus that is detected in the vaccinated person's nose may not be all that capable of infecting others. But we have to wait till more is known, and maybe the CDC recommendations will change. But in the meantime, it's a 10-day isolation if you get tested, if you get test positive for COVID. In general, the overwhelming majority of reported cases of transmission by a vaccinated person happen inside of a household. where there's continuous and prolonged contact. So somewhere in that prolonged period of time, the vaccinated person infects someone else during the narrow window of time when he or she might be infectious. The other situations where when vaccinated people are known to transmit to others is during more intense, close crowded interaction, like at bars or dancing. And it also could be that alcohol makes people shout more and release more virus. But casual interactions among vaccinated people, even indoors, is really not worrisome. I mean, I'm saying vaccinated and boosted people. It shouldn't be worrisome. Okay, what about masks? So much politics and controversy over masks. All I can say is that the degree of protection offered by a vaccine is huge, and the degree of protection offered by a mask is modest. It's something, but it's not huge. So a vaccinated person adding a mask is maybe adding a little protection. An unvaccinated person wearing a mask is reducing his or her transmission potential and risk somewhat, but nothing compared to if that person got a vaccine. So in a setting where everyone is vaccinated, I believe, it's my opinion, masks are unnecessary and people should feel comfortable. Even if someone in that group ultimately tests COVID positive, he was probably a very poor transmitter, and the vaccinated and boosted people who were unmasked were most certainly adequately protected. However, once unvaccinated people are in the mix, it becomes more complicated. We could view every unvaccinated person as a potential infection source, and then everyone in that situation has to make a risk assessment for themselves. But remember, if you're vaccinated and boosted, you are highly unlikely to get COVID from a casual interaction, and you have a near zero chance of winding up in a hospital. So that's where we are right now. I think I'll stop here, and Ari, I'll open it up to Q&A.
Okay, thank you so much, Teena. I'm going to, first of all, ask you if you can repeat the names of the rapid tests that you mentioned earlier, slowly, so anybody
people can write it down.
Yeah.
Okay, so there's one called Binax, B-I-N-A-X now, it's by Abbott, and another one called QuickVue, V-U-E, Q-U-I-C-K-V-U-E by Quidel. Those have been in the drugstores for the longest, and most people have the most experience with them. They're really simple. I recommend them highly. There's another one by CareStart, which also C-A-R-E-S-T-A-R-T. I haven't seen it in the drugstores, but if you see it, I've used those as well, and they're really good. There are 3 or 4 new ones coming on the market. I don't even know if they're in the stores, but I just noticed on the FDA website that there have been recent approvals. And like I said, you can look at the instructions and see if they're very similar. If they go through that process of just swabbing, putting it in a liquid, squirting it on a piece of paper, and waiting for 2 lines, then those should be good tests to use.
Okay, the next couple of questions, they really look at the issue of being socializing, being indoors, eating, being in a restaurant, being at a function, from 2 different angles. One, regardless of any other elements, is asking if you, and I think you've answered this question, if you'd be comfortable eating in a restaurant if you're triple vaxxed. And I think you answered
Yes.
pretty much, yes, you would be.
Yes.
Okay, and then the other one is more of a question of testing. Somebody's going to be at a family get-together that includes children who are below 5, who won't even be able to get vaxxed when, as this rolls out for 5 to 11-year-olds. And you're going to be with other people who will be in contact with those who are vulnerable. Should you be testing yourself beforehand? Should you be testing yourself afterwards? Where does testing play a useful role when you're planning to be with other people in an environment like that with kids who are unvaccinated?
Right. So I think the kids with the grandparent, the kids with the vulnerable adult scenario, it's certainly, there's nothing wrong, and it would make everybody comfortable if the kids were tested before the interaction. So if like next week on Thanksgiving, there's going to be big family get together, even the 5 to 11-year-olds may have only had one shot. They're not fully vaccinated yet. It'll make everybody feel better to know that nobody is actively potentially transmitting COVID on that day. And then if you want to monitor afterwards, then it's up to you. I mean, if somebody doesn't have any symptoms and doesn't know that there were, know of a real exposure, it's not necessary to continue testing. And in general, the vaccinated people don't have to be tested unless there's a real reason for it.
Okay, so the next question is one that is also rather pertinent for myself, having a child who is under 5 years old. There's a question as to what is the status at this point, I guess, of the majors, their investigations into when they'll be able to, or if they'll be able to have a vaccine for children under 5 years old.
So, so from what I've read and what I've heard Pfizer presenting, there's basically 2 more tranches below the 5-year-olds. So we had the 5 to 11 now. The next group is the 2 to 5 or 2 through 4, and the group after that is the 6 months to 2 years old. So Pfizer's been very quiet about the 2 to 4-year-olds in the last month or two, hasn't said too much about it. I suspect because they were very focused on this 5 to 11-year-old category and they didn't really want to distract everybody from it. But prior to them being quiet about it, they were always talking about the 2 to 4-year-olds being basically 2 months behind. The study started a long time ago. So I would not be surprised if sometime in maybe late December, early January, the Pfizer announces that they're ready to submit it to the FDA. And the FDA has now been very quick in turning these things around, like in a matter of 3 or 4 weeks. So I think we have salvation. We have vaccines coming for the 2 to 4-year-olds probably in the next, in the next 2 or 3 months. And then for the under 2-year-olds, I would think it would be a few months after that. Also, from what I read, is certainly in the youngest group, the dose is 1/10 the adult dose, and I cannot remember if in the 2 to 4-year-olds it's the same 1/3 as the 5-year-olds or it's the same 1/10 as the younger ones, but it's one of those two.
Okay, thank you. Another question is asking about travel for seniors who are vaxxed and boosted, specifically travel to Israel, more specifically travel in a closed environment like an airplane for 10, 12 hours at a time. Is there, I mean, aside from the obvious consideration of somewhat increased risk, if you're triple vaccinated, is it something to be concerned about?
Okay, so Israel's a very good question because the Israelis also have a very strict entry rule. So Israel will not let you into the country basically unless you're either triple vaccinated. Well, in one way or another, you have to be within 6 months of your last vaccine. So if you had your second vaccine in March, April, May, they won't let you in unless you're boosted. So the nice thing, and actually I just came back from Israel. I was there for a week. So I could say, first of all, it's very unpleasant to be on a plane for 10 hours with a mask, but that's what it is. But the nice thing is that because of these strict entry criteria into a country like Israel, at least you know that every single person on the plane has been COVID tested. Israel requires a PCR, not a rapid test, in order to get into the country. So everybody on the plane has been tested. I think maybe Israel's relaxing and they'll do rapid tests on the day of. But in any case, everyone on the plane tested negative, and everyone on the plane has presented documentation that they were vaccinated in the last 6 months. So I think on that flight, the risks are relatively low, and people are wearing masks, etc. And then when you get to Israel, they test you again. So that's probably, of all the travel locations, that's the most thoroughly tested population with you on the plane. Other places, again, it all goes back to the same, okay, things really aren't, it's not like if you wait around, things are going to get dramatically better. This is kind of where we're at. So, if you want to visit your relative in California and you're triply vaccinated, like you just have to make that decision, how important it is for you to go visit your relative in California, which could be very important if you haven't seen that person in a long time.
Right. Okay. Next question is an inquiry about changes to menstrual bleeding, and specifically how changes and concerns about fertility that have been reported, and sources aren't mentioned here, but that this is being reported and documented. Is that a concern that you're aware of? And is there anything that you want to address about this?
Okay, so I know that, obviously it's been talked about. There are a lot of scare stories, as I said. The American College of Obstetricians and Gynecology, the American Society for Reproductive Medicine, various other groups of physicians that are involved in women's health and in pregnancy and fertility have all looked at this and studied the data and the incidences of all the various outcomes, and are not finding any correlation between vaccine and any particular outcome. Obviously there's always anecdotal reports and people experience this, that, or the other, and that happens regardless of the vaccine. So really you have to look at it in the context of large numbers and see whether there's any difference, and they're not seeing a difference. So the American Society of Obstetricians and Gynecology and the American Society of Reproductive Medicine are overwhelmingly, out there actively recommending vaccinations for women, because the outcomes for COVID, from getting COVID, are so much worse.
Right. Okay. The next question is a bit of a look forward, a look ahead. And it basically asks the question, where are we going to be 6 months, a year, 2 years, a few years down the line from this? Is COVID, as it mutates and we get further and further away from the variants that we've all heard of, is it going to go the way of the common cold or the flu? Is it something that we're going to live with? As you said, we're going to need to live with it, but is it something that is going to become, get your annual vaccine and just, worry if you're sick, but otherwise, use your judgment when you visit people? Is that how we're going to look at it a few years from now?
Yeah, I think that's the goal. That's originally the goal, that was talked about, was to eliminate COVID, but it turns out that that's not a practical goal. It's just not happening. And there isn't enough compliance in the populations, in Western populations, and maybe there's not enough access in other populations. We just can't get every single person on the globe vaccinated. So instead, the goal and the most likely outcome is that it continues to be what they call endemic. It's there, and we have to deal with it, and it might be annual vaccines like the flu. I think the goal is to turn COVID into the flu. Initially, people were saying, oh, it's just, it's nothing, it's just like the flu. It wasn't. The number of people who died from COVID is multiples of the number of people who died from flu. But if that gets reduced to the same level as flu, and the disruption is the same as the disruption of the flu, then I think we can all live with that.
Okay, I just want to let everybody know that we've got time for maybe one more question. If there are any more, we're going to just give you a minute. And anybody who wants to add a question in the chat, now is probably your last opportunity for this session. And not seeing any. All right. Thank you so much. We are all very grateful for your expertise and the clarity of your explanation. And of course, you know, as things change and evolve around this, we're probably going to come back to you for more advice and for more explanation. So thank you so much for, you know, on behalf of everybody who joined tonight.
Okay, thank you, everybody. And thanks, Ari, for being such a great host. Bye.
Bye, everyone.